Good afternoon, happy lunchtime, good evening. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Increasing Trust in Artificial Intelligence. My name is Elizabeth Hild. I'm the director of the Ethics Center at Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'm going to moderate this webinar. Our topic today is trust in artificial intelligence, how to interact with technology, how much trust to put in machines, how much trust to put in artificial intelligence, what are implications of putting trust in artificial intelligence, when is artificial intelligence trustworthy, and is trust the right concept at all when interacting with AI, artificial intelligence? We'll discuss these and a number of related questions today, and it's my really great pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have three panelists. Jason Borenstein, he is the director of graduate research ethics programs at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. The next speaker is Hille Hake from the Loyola University of Chicago. She holds a Richard McCormick Endowed Chair of Catholic Moral Theology there. And Roberto Sicari, the founder of the Frankfurt Big Data Lab. He joins us from Finland, where he currently is an affiliated professor. So good evening there. Each speaker will give a presentation of around 10 to 15 minutes, and all of this will be followed by a discussion. Please type your questions or comments you may have in the chat. I'd also like to introduce Kelly Lass, the librarian, researcher, and ethics educator at the Ethics Center. She'll manage the technical part of the webinar and she'll help us with the questions. After each panelist, we'll allow 2 or 3 short questions, and the main discussion then will be after the 3 presentations. So let's begin. The first speaker is going to be Jason Borenstein. Jason is the director of graduate research ethics programs at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. He has directed the Institute's responsible conduct of research programs since 2006, and he is part of the leadership team for the Ethics, Technology, and Human Interaction Center. He is a very experienced researcher in robot and artificial intelligence ethics, in engineering ethics, research ethics, and bioethics. In his presentation, Jason will talk about different definitions of trust, how people trust AI, and the so-called overtrust phenomenon. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Jason.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation today, and welcome everyone to this event. So yes, I'm at Georgia Tech. I've been here for quite a while. I've been working in the space of AI ethics and robot ethics for well over a decade now, and I'll talk about one of my primary areas. It's the connection between computing technology and trust. So I will talk a bit about AI and robots both during the course of my presentation today. So just to give some framing for what I plan to focus on for the next 10 minutes or so, I tend to primarily focus on a phenomenon referred to as overtrust, which I'll provide a definition for that shortly. But I think we all know, if we're familiar with AI systems and robots, such as chatbots or self-driving vehicles or things of that sort, I think we understand that when we interact and potentially rely on these technologies, that they could have serious consequences for us, good and potentially harmful. So that's among the reasons why, of course, trust is important to discuss. Just in terms of framing my discussion or what I'm going to focus on, I know in the literature and in different communities, not everyone is particularly fond of this term trust as it pertains to using it to describe our interaction with computing technology. I'm largely going to bypass that discussion. I suspect others might discuss that issue today during our panel, but I'm largely going to bypass that particular issue for my presentation. Just quickly on that, some would suggest that reliable is a better term than trust, but I'm just going to assume trust is the term that I can use for today, and I'll leave it at that. So in terms of trust and overtrust, somewhat interrelated concepts, of course, there's a broad collection of publications, a broad collection of literatures related to trust across various different fields and disciplines. I'll primarily be drawing from the computing literature, so to speak, instead of philosophical or psychological literatures, although of course they intertwine at times, but I'll primarily be talking about a notion of trust that's influenced by these two definitions mentioned here from the computing literature, one from 1997 and one from 2004, the latter from Lee and See. Essentially, we're talking about two main concepts here. The first, of course, being trust. And what we're largely talking about there is a user's reliance on a technology and whether they think a technology can deliver on the promise that the user potentially perceives. And of course, connected to that is the potential that a user might overtrust the technology, which I'll define a bit more directly in the next slide in terms of a definition that colleagues and I have used in some of our research. But essentially what we're getting at with overtrust is this notion that a user or a person who interacts with an AI system, whether it's a chatbot, self-driving car, or another computing technology, might project on it traits or abilities that it might not possess. So to speak a bit more directly about that, this is a primary definition of overtrust that my colleagues, Ayana Howard, Alan Wagner, and I have discussed in some of our publications. The publications, there's two main ones that we worked on a few years ago, has to do with how parents and clinicians may trust or potentially overtrust robotic exoskeletons when those exoskeletons are being used in the case of parents with the parent's child, or in the case of clinicians with pediatric patients they may be treating. So what I am going to point out here with the definition of overtrust that we've used in our publications is two main ideas. First is the notion that the person who interacts with computing technology, whether it's an AI system or robot, accepts the risk because they believe that system, in our work it was largely talking about robots, but believes that system can perform a function that it actually cannot. So for instance, if you're interacting with a chatbot and think it might call the fire department or the police for you, but it actually can't, that's one notion of overtrust, is projecting onto the technology something it cannot do. And a somewhat related notion, the second part, is that the person or the user who's interacting with the technology might accept more risk than they perhaps should because they suspect that that system would potentially have safety features that would protect the person, which, of course, we could talk about in terms of autonomous vehicles or other computing systems, that the user who interacts with it thinks that it might have a braking feature or lane correction feature of some sort or another, but perhaps it actually does not. So that's essentially the beginning points for overtrust. So overtrust in general, there's various different examples. In the interest of time, I'll go over this briefly. So when GPS was really first starting to be integrated into cars and or into our smartphones, there of course were examples where drivers and others were perhaps over-reliant on it, perhaps even ignoring their own senses, their own eyes or ears or other sources of information and deferring to the computing technology, at times driving off the road, for example. There's also, of course, different safety features that might be embedded in cars that we might potentially, again, ignore our own senses and defer to the system, like a backup camera on a car. So these are just some general examples at the intersection of overtrust and computing. But more specifically, just to give you a sense at the intersection of AI and overtrust, some of the ones that are being developed now and currently in our lives include chatbots, including ones that are being developed for wellness or mental health kinds of purposes. So for instance, computing experts, computer scientists, and others might be developing chatbots such as the Woebot, for example, that are supposed to be used so you could discuss particular types of wellness-related conditions. So for example, if someone is experiencing depression, maybe they could talk with the chatbot and the chatbot potentially could triage the situation. Well, of course, one of the potential concerns there is whether the user might overtrust in this case, a patient or individual might overtrust the chatbot, and the chatbot potentially can't deliver on what the person actually needs, like assistance from a human being, for example, if the chatbot is not programmed specifically enough to know when to hand off to a human in this situation. And there are, of course, others in terms of the human interaction with self-driving vehicles. And then the third one about how physicians might be trusting or deferring to AI systems, including in radiology, perhaps because they might have the assumption that a computing system might be bias-free. But of course, we might be able to recognize how that might be fraught with problems to assume a computing technology does not have bias. Undertrust is, of course, important as well. So overtrust was the starting point where we might project onto the system more than it potentially has, more functionality or capability than it necessarily has. But it also could be problematic to intervene too quickly, for example. So for instance, if you're riding in a self-driving car like a Waymo or a Tesla, and the autopilot might be safer to rely on, but the person in the car, let's say, panics because they're not sure how the system might react, intervening too quickly might actually put someone at risk at times more than just relying on the system. And that's in part why, which I'll get to relatively soon, trust calibration is important. And one way of restating that is letting the user, the person interacting with the system, know how much trust they should be placing in the system, rather than leaving it vague or unclear how much trust is appropriate. So of course, ethical concerns related to how much trust we place in computing technology, including AI. So nudging. So for example, the more we place trust in a chatbot, the more potentially it could help to push or manipulate our behavior. So as we trust, let's say, a therapy chatbot, the chatbot could encourage us to buy certain kinds of products, for example. It could nudge us to certain behavioral directions. So that's just one example of ethical concerns. Another I'll just mention towards the bottom of this slide is the risk of self-harm. That particular citation there by Dawes talks about a chatbot that was being created for mental health purposes. And this is a hypothetical scenario that they were using with a fictional patient. But just to describe what occurred, is the chatbot was being used to console or to assist a person who was suffering from depression. And this hypothetical person suggested that they were having suicidal thoughts. And one of the chatbot's response was, "Let me help you with that." So of course, that's a standard kind of response from like a customer service agent, but in the particular context, that's particularly dangerous to have that kind of response for someone who potentially might have serious mental health worries. Factors influencing levels of trust, which I know I need to keep to time, so I'll go over this quickly. Emotional attachment, of course. So if it has aesthetic designs, like if it's a virtual avatar on our phone and has a face and eyes, that can create emotional bonding. The features of the voice may encourage bonding, depending on whether we find it to be a soothing voice or a voice that we find annoying. These kinds of things that may encourage us to more strongly attach and more strongly bond to an AI system opens the room for trust. But of course, as we trust more, there's more potential for harm. Other things, and potentially we'll have some time to discuss this during discussion period, the Q&A period, but in the area of trust and determining what's appropriate level of trust, we might also discuss what measures can help mitigate and create this appropriate trust calibration. So I just gave some examples. So this could be for chatbots or other systems where it might require, for example, the person interacting with the system, perhaps, for instance, with a self-driving car, then maybe certification might be needed before relying on the system as a way to prevent overtrust. Also, if it's an AI system that maybe a child is using, for example, perhaps it would seek input from a parent or guardian before it proceeds. So if the child is asking to purchase something, for instance, like a customer service agent or a customer chatbot, that maybe it would potentially need the authorization from another person in addition to the user. So that could be another trust mitigation strategy. A couple other things that I'll just say quickly is trust calibration when considering what might be measures to generate an appropriate level of trust in an AI system like a chatbot. We do need to keep in mind that not all users are the same. So this could be discussed along a variety of different lines, including adults versus children, different populations, different regions of the world, different levels of language proficiency. Of course, there's a lot to be talked about there, but we can't assume that one trust mitigation strategy will work equally well with different populations. So some concluding thoughts, assuming that it's appropriate to use AI for sorts of tasks that I've been describing, which is a big assumption, but I'm leaving aside for the time being. If we're going to use AI for the sorts of things I've been describing, like chatbots or embedded in self-driving cars, having an appropriate level of trust is, of course, important. And it requires trying to balance out over-trust and under-trust. And then again, we need to make sure that we keep in mind who might interact with the technology and don't assume that they're all the same. My references, and if anyone would like a copy of my slides, I'm happy to share. I can put my email address in the chat later on. Other related work in the space. So I have done a fair amount of work with a colleague who used to be at Georgia Tech, Ayanna Howard, amongst others, in the trust space. And then one last thing I'll just mention related to AI and trust. We recently got funded an AI Institute, which is essentially one of the main elements of it is to try to create AI agents to help older adults coordinate their care, their health care. It's a 5-year project, and I'm one of the co-leads of Ethics and Trust for this AI Institute. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for your time, and I'll hand it over to Elizabeth for next steps.
Thank you, Jason, for this fascinating talk and the distinctions between overtrust, undertrust, and then in the middle there's the sort of adequate trust, real trust, calibrated trust, and of course, how can we get there? This is the question, isn't it? Right. And also, I mean, anthropomorphic features will extremely favor overtrust. There is a question in the chat. James Gray says these examples are wonderful in general, but seem to assume that there's one major user at a time. Even in the case of a physician interpreting a scan, this assumption seems to be there. Any information about trust in situations in which there is more than one interested user? So that's of course a problem. There's a broad spectrum of users, isn't it? I mean, more naive ones, more experienced ones, older ones, younger ones, whatever.
Right.
That's going to be really difficult.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it shouldn't assume that if a technology works well in the lab, it's necessarily going to translate well to the external world. And similarly, if it seems to be working well, so to speak, with a particular user base or particular population in the short run, shouldn't necessarily it's going to map on well to different regions of the world with different populations, different age groups, different needs. So yes, it very much needs to be more nuanced than just saying it's one monolithic version of trust for a particular type of technology. Anything from a chatbot to a self-driving car to other kinds of AI systems. So quite right, I agree. There needs to be more nuance to discussions about who those people might be that interact with these systems.
Maybe even a categorization like this is a stage 3, level 4, level 5, level 10 AI system. You are only experienced with level 2 or so. I mean, this is fictitious right now, but I mean, yeah, this is a huge topic, of course, and I'm sure we have an opportunity to discuss this later. But now let's move on to our next speaker. Hille Harker. Hille holds the Richard McCormick Endowed Chair of Catholic Moral Theology at Loyola University, Chicago. She served on several bioethics committees, including the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies to the European Commission. This group gives a lot of reports that are really very influential on the way the European Commission goes. Hille's recent books are Towards a Critical Political Ethics, Catholic Ethics and Social Challenges, and she co-edited a volume, Unaccompanied Migrant Children, Social, Legal, and Ethical Perspectives. And obviously, both are really timely books on very important social issues. So it's great that you are here today, Hille, and that you are going to give your presentation. Hille will reflect on how trust in machines is similar to or different from trust in other forms of interaction. And she'll characterize human agency in human AI interaction as vulnerable agency. So I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Jason, for bringing us right into the center of the discussion. What I want to do here is just very shortly 4 steps: the experience of new technologies, the mimetic relations and artificial intelligence, the question of trust and trustworthiness, and then Elizabeth just alluded to it, the difference or distinction between functional and vulnerable agency. So I'm beginning with a kind of a bird's eyes view, if you like. So experiencing new technologies, I have to say that it depends on already where and from which perspectives we are talking. I can only talk about Western cultures. So cultures matter, how we approach new technologies. And let me just recall that, you know, modernity and certainly our contemporary cultures are very much defined as science societies or knowledge societies, and new technologies play a big role in that. But new technologies may be experienced as strange, as alien, as risky, but at the same time also as exciting, as new, as threatening, depending on cultural approaches and past experiences. So this ambiguity is not different with AI systems and or AI devices. Reflecting on modern technologies in the 20th century is very interesting for our current discussions, I think. Let me just point to a few people here. Martin Heidegger, who has become quite important for phenomenological and post-phenomenological approaches to AI. His stance of being in the world and authenticity is kind of almost juxtaposed to the modern stance towards technologies. And so he was kind of very critical of technologies being stumbling blocks for our own personal authenticity. Another person who is dear to me is Walter Benjamin, who right from the start of his philosophy reflected upon the mimetic relationships, for example, in role playing, but also with respect to the humanization of things. And with more learning during childhood, especially, modern Western societies gear children towards taking a more instrumental relationship. That has been even kind of increased as a critique. Walter Benjamin also belonged to the Frankfurt School, but there were others, Lukács today, Honneth, or Rahel Jaeggi, who retrieve the critique that Marx for the first time actually raised in the 19th century, but certainly there's also an echo of that in the Catholic social teaching tradition, speaking of the reification and alongside with that, the alienation. Today, there are also philosophies of sociology or sociologists who lean very much towards philosophy. And I only want to mention Hartmut Rosa, whose work on resonance, by now translated into English, has been rather influential. This might become then a counter term to the alienation. And the main point of that is we yearn to resonate with the world, resonate with others, resonate with ourselves, but also maybe with a divine. And the question then is whether technologies are part of the problem or part of the solution. So this is the bird's eyes view here. And I want to focus a little bit on the mimetic relationships and juxtapose the humanization of things and the reification of humans. What do I mean by that? Just a very short example. We all play with toys or dolls when we are children, and as children, we certainly humanize things, um, make them into small human beings, because that is what we do as human beings. We imitate what others do, and for example, our parents then become the or the model for our role playing, but we also approach others, including things, in a in a way that is relational. Now, we also know, of course, that as much as we can, here's Hello Barbie, and if we had the time, I would show you a video of what she can do. We do not only interact with dolls or toys as if they were humans or things of the real world, so to say, but we also often, as children and as adults, we want to know how they function, and we tear them apart. So you can see that this, of course, is not what a child should do with an AI device here, because it might be dangerous. And then, of course, the producers have to make sure that they are safe. But we can also go further, deeper into the devices and see what exactly is the embedded artificial intelligence here when we talk about a device like Hello Barbie, who interacts with children and becomes a kind of a little kindergarten teacher even. So I think the production has been stopped by now. But there are other ways. Of course, we know that here is a little bot named Qt Robot, if that is correctly pronounced, from Luxai. He could be the link, the website says, between therapists, parents, and autistic children. So the robot, which features an LCD face and robotic arms, allows kids who are overwhelmed by human contact to become more comfortable in a therapeutic setting. This too makes use of the mimetic relationships that we have, however, under particular conditions. Okay, so in some of that part, we are dealing with a paradox of the human-machine relationship. On the one hand side, we tend to depersonalize interactions. For example, if we are talking to robots on the phone or something, and human relations in general, and maybe even human connections in the human-machine relationship, and much has been written and talked about the substitution of human relationships by robots. And on the other hand, however, we humanize things through anthropomorphism and the mimesis that is part of the human condition. Okay, and we have to deal with this paradox when we approach the notion of trust, or the question of trust and trustworthiness in artificial intelligence. That's my next part. So what is trust and trustworthiness in the context of AI? Very shortly, kind of taking the baton from Jason here, and want to say that trust and trustworthiness of AI, many people, especially the philosophers who have read Annette Bayer's work on this distinction, say it is actually the reliability. I would say, well, we cannot just say AI is geared towards reliability. I would say it's the reliability plus the ethical design, and that will become bit important. So first of all, let us talk a little bit about that. What makes an AI system device trustworthy? It's safety and reliability, its security, its accuracy, its reversibility, I would say, its transparency, it's the clear distinction between functional and human agents, so a kind of a limitation of the humanization, the reliance on human accountability, but also sustainability and energy efficiency. So there's a lot of overlap in what Jason came up with, and I think there will also be a lot of overlap with what the high-level expert group that I think Roberto will point to has come up with, but it is pretty simple to sit down and just think, what would we want an AI system or device to do or to be in order for us to trust them. So trusting requires that we can be vulnerable to others, vulnerable also to the betrayal in particular, that we can think well of others, at least in certain domains, and that we can be optimistic that they are, or at least will be, competent in certain respects. This is a definition that I think her name is Anne McLeod gave, and it is quoted in a more recent article that I can recommend by Margaret Zutrop, Should We Trust Artificial Intelligence? And if you want, I can point you to the article. Okay, so trustworthiness, in my own words now, means to expect that the other will do no harm intentionally, understand the difference between good and bad and evil, and between right and wrong. But if that is a definition that we can share, then I would say AI systems can only be trustworthy in a metaphorical sense. Why? Well, first, positions matter. On the one hand side, in the act of trusting, from that position, the self expects the other to be a trustworthy subject or system or device. But that is also kind of true vice versa, that the other system device expects the other to be trusting. And Jason already pointed to the risk to be exploited due to emotional attachment and so on. So there's the risk to be exploited or to exploit and betray or be betrayed in one's trust. That is one of the functions of the concept of trust. So let me quickly turn to the functional versus vulnerable agency and the juxtaposition of artificial agents and human agents. Okay. The AI high-level expert group of the European Union produced, let's say, guidelines in 2019, and they asked, how does an AI system achieve rationality? And what I call functional agency, I will not read out the whole quote, but just bear with me here with the highlighted verbs. They can perceive, they can interpret, they can reason, they can decide, and then act accordingly through some actuators, thus possibly modifying the environment. That is what I call agency, but it is functional because, let us just refer to two important philosophers here, Paul Ricoeur, who speaks of the capable humans, I'll come back to that in a moment, and Charles Taylor, who says that human beings are language animals. Giving meaning to one's life is necessarily subjective and unique. And the question now is whether all the rationality that AI systems come with actually have the capability to give meaning to their lives. Whereas Ricoeur defines the capabilities of humans as being able to speak, to remember, to act, and to account for one's actions over time. So let us go into that a little bit more. Machines, my thesis is, are functional agents, but not moral agents. Acts can indeed be ascribed to them. They can act meaningful, but they cannot aim for a good life with and for others in just institutions, which is the definition by Ricoeur of moral agency. They cannot claim rights towards others. Of course, all that is contested, but I'm throwing it out here. Okay, they cannot feel shame, regret, guilt, pain. They cannot even suffer other than by design. As we know, they can be designed not to feel pain and so on. They cannot be held accountable for their actions. Think of self-driving cars. And yet this does not mean that they are morally neutral. So this is very, very difficult to distinguish. And I think in the literature over the last decade or so, a lot has been kind of mashed together or merged. And I want to kind of distinguish again to understand better what exactly the agency is that AI systems or devices have, and what their capabilities are and what that means ethically. So moral agents are not only autonomous and responsible agents. Moral agents, I hold, are vulnerable agents. They are vulnerable on an ontological level. That means they are mortals and that they are susceptible to suffering. They are morally vulnerable, meaning they are susceptible not only to suffering in general, but actually to be morally injured, meaning to be humiliated, to be misrecognized, disrespected, and so on, be shamed, for example. That is what I mean by moral injury. And they are vulnerable and susceptible to structural vulnerabilities due to their particular vulnerabilities, actually to disability, age, or something, and unequal treatments, for example. Yeah. So summing up, AI, vulnerable agency, and trust. Let me say this: AI devices are not vulnerable. They cannot suffer. They cannot be harmed, and they cannot be discriminated against, other than metaphorically. Humans instead are vulnerable and capable, open to others, responsible and accountable for their actions. Their agency makes them prone to inflict moral injuries upon others. At the same time, however, our vulnerability makes us humans susceptible to harm. Human beings approach some intelligent machines with their capability to relate to others, to make them human, with all emotions, including trust. Not AI, but their designers must be trustworthy. So thank you. I can do that because I also use an embedded tiny little bit of AI here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hille, for this great presentation and for giving us a philosophical framework for human AI interaction, agency, trust. This is very interesting. I was thinking there is, on the one hand, this idea that trustworthy AI is reliable, is transparent, and all of these things, which seem to be clear aspects that can be scientifically checked. And on the other hand, there's this human reaction, where the trust term comes in. So trustworthy AI or trust in AI basically is about how humans react. And I was thinking, when you talked about trustworthy AI, you had the criteria that they do no harm and that they understand the difference between right and wrong, isn't it? And this is our way of this. This could be a minimal definition of moral agency already. And probably that's the thing that we interpret, we react to them as if they were moral agents, or there is a tendency to.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, what Jason said about the attachment and the exploitation of emotional attachments, we see that all over the place. You're starting the AI care project here. Look at the nursing homes and Paro, the robot, or other devices, and we cannot, but we are relational, we are mimetic in my words here. Yeah, so we imitate and we present and represent to each other who we are, so we find similarities and so on, but we are relational beings as human beings, and that is why we are prone to trust. But whether the other side then is trustworthy, I wanted to say, is up to the designer behind it.
There are questions for Hille by Eddie Namias. Are your claims about current machines or any possible future machines, AI or robots? If the latter, what is the basic reason why they could not, for example, suffer, have genuine goals, gain moral understanding?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, there's the discussion is ongoing in the philosophy of and ethics of artificial intelligence, and at the end of the day, of course, we can define, for example, suffering in different ways. But I would say that there is a certain, let's say, passivity or receptivity that we cannot circumvent. And if you program, let's say, a robot to show some signs of pain and so on, it's still only the algorithms and the design that has defined it ahead of time to feel pain. Without subjectivity, it seems to me pretty difficult. And why? Because, like in Greek, for example, you have pathos. Pathos is suffering, and at the same time also a certain passivity or receptivity that you cannot control. And that, for me, is the difference when I speak of suffering, for example. I'm speaking of current and future devices, of course.
There are a lot of interesting questions popping in, especially one about my recent paper on consciousness, but maybe we move this to the final discussion. And thank you for your questions. Just type them in the chat. We'll come back to them later. Let's first have our third speaker, Roberto Sicari. Roberto was a professor of database and information systems at the Goethe University of Frankfurt in Germany, where he founded the Frankfurt Big Data Lab. Currently, he is an affiliated professor at the Högskolan in Helsinki in Finland, and an adjunct professor at the Seoul National University in South Korea. Roberto is leading a team of international experts who defined an assessment process for trustworthy AI called Z-inspection, probably you would say Z-inspection in the US. I have to say that I'm also part of this team, and in his presentation, he'll introduce the Z-inspection process and talk about case studies analyzed so far. It's your turn, Roberto.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. And I also would like to thank you, the other two panelists, because they give me exactly the framework for the explanation of the work we have been doing until now. Basically, we started this work, this research work, more than 3 years ago with a very pragmatic focus, which basically is, if I am in a situation where somebody is trying to use an AI system in a real situation, in real life, how do I make a decision whether this AI system is really for good or it might be harming people? And the other situation that we've been looking at is, how can we help engineers that are certainly not trained in ethics, and sometimes they don't even really are trained in the domain specifically. How can we help them in early design to include elements that could avoid that the system that they are actually designing and deploying will create harm? So this is really a practitioner work. We go from concept to best practices in real life. And we have a system, well, we have a process that we call Z-inspection, that we assess real system. The system is actually based on work that has been done in, for example, the European Commission, Helle has mentioned some of the framework for trustworthy AI that was defined by the so-called independent high-level expert group of artificial intelligence. This is actually a framework that is very important in Europe because it is likely going to be the cornerstone for regulation. You might like it or you might not like it, and there are several similar frameworks, but that's one framework where they define 4 ethical principles based on fundamental rights The first three, you are not really surprised. Respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, whatever fairness means. And then they invented a fourth one with the new, actually English word called explicability. Now, with this fourth principle, you don't really, you're not really able to, in practice, make decision. So what they did, they tried to give requirements. They call it trustworthy AI requirement. There are 7 requirements, and there are also some sub-requirements. The 7 key requirements are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, which is basically the counterpart of explicability, diversity, non-discrimination, fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. Now, we took this framework, we added to these frameworks 2 more requirements that are embedded there but not explicitly mentioned. One is assessing if the ecosystem where the AI is embedded respect values of Western democracy. And the second one is avoiding concentration of power. Now, the idea is to have a process where you are able to work in various phases, either at co-creation time, so helping engineers to define a system that has some features that are trustworthy, or if it's actually already deployed, to assess, the implication of this, and it could eventually maybe be used for certification or auditing and monitoring over time, because an AI system actually changes over time. Now, since I don't have a lot of time, I can give you a little explanation of the process, how it looks like. So, this is basically the process in a nutshell. What we are doing, we are bringing, first of all, we look at some preconditions, if there are certain conflict of interest and whether there are, why you want to do an assessment. So who is asking for an assessment? And then we form a team of multidisciplinary experts that are really ranging from philosophers to domain experts to engineers to legal people. And basically what we do is we define the boundaries of what we want to assess. When you talk about AI, you never assess only the software. You actually look at all the implications, so the processes, the people. And so basically you need to define the boundaries and the context. Once you have that, we use something that we call social technical scenario, where basically you are describing the aim of the AI system, the actors, the stakeholder, their expectation, interaction, the processes, the technology, and the context. And basically, this can be done either at design phase, or it could be done with a system that is already being implemented and deployed. By doing that, then you bring together all kinds of experts who normally don't talk to each other. They normally talk different languages. A philosopher talking to a medical doctor or talking to a machine learning engineers, they have great difficulty, or a legal expert, they have great difficulty to have the same language and even the same mindset. And what we're doing, we let them describe what they think are issues that are derived from the use of this particular AI in this particular context. So we let them use an open vocabulary. And basically they define ethical issues or tension, legal issues, technical issues, or domain-specific issues. And the interesting thing is that if you only will live like this, then you will never arrive to any conclusion, because the discussion will not converge. So basically we use this framework, which is the framework of the 7 requirements and the 4 ethical principles, and we force a discussion that was in open vocabulary to be mapped into the ethical principle and the requirements. By doing that, we are forcing the vocabulary into templates. And I know it sounds funny, because especially for philosophers, to going from open vocabulary to templates sounds really strange, but that's a way we can then have different people with different background being able to compare and come up with consensus. Having done that, we then look at the claims, because every time an AI system is being designed or implemented, there are claims. And claims need to be supported by evidence. And by doing that, we split the work in working groups. So the technical people will verify the technical claims. The legal people will look at some of the legal issues and the ethical as well. Maybe there is at the end not a solution. And basically we come up with a list that could be ethical tension or trade-off. And some of the assumption will sustain, let's support claims, some will not. And then we give recommendation. And then if necessary, you know, it could be an ethical maintenance. Now, this sounds like very abstract, but basically, and I want to give you one snippet of how did we use it in practice. So we've been working with the city of Copenhagen in Denmark, and with the set of hospital there. They are called emergency medical services, and it is part of the clinical things. And basically, what is important in Europe, when you are calling for emergency, health emergency, you call in a number which is 112. In the United States would be 911. So when you call 112 in Copenhagen, normally there is a so-called dispatcher that answers the phone and try to understand why you are actually calling. So in some cases, somebody, a so-called bystander, is calling because somebody in the house seems to be dead. In reality, what this person had as a cardiac arrest, so the heart stopped working, so the person is totally dead, and the person calling is under stress, is trying to explain to the dispatcher, listen, there is somebody that doesn't move. And during a conversation, the dispatcher has to understand why this person is calling and what kind of priority, you know, you send an ambulance. And 25% of cases where the person that is calling is describing a so-called out of the hospital cardiac arrest, they are not detected, meaning that the dispatcher is not able to understand this situation. And basically, if you have a cardiac arrest, you need to, within 5 minutes, to do a so-called reanimation. So the dispatcher should be calling should be instructing the person to do a reanimation on the phone. So it basically said, please put your hands on the chest and do a reanimation. If you don't do that in 5 minutes, the brain might be damaged or the ambulance might arrive too late. Now, having said that, the doctors realized that 25% of these cases were not handled correctly, so people might die. And so they actually appointed a startup from the University of Copenhagen to do an AI system that will listen to the call, to the conversation, and would predict if by listening to the conversation, there is a risk of a cardiac arrest, and basically signal with the sound, like an alert, to the dispatcher, well, there is a risk of a high risk of a cardiac arrest. Interesting enough, and that's basically is really what Jason was saying about trust and overtrust, and also what Elliot was talking about, you know, the moral framework. They actually did some clinical trials. So in the first clinical trial, they have the AI system being used on audio files of all the calls without people, and the AI was very accurate. It was actually able to detect cardiac arrest better than people. Then they did a so-called randomized clinical trial where they take 2 groups of people on real call. The dispatcher without the AI listened to the call, and a group of dispatchers listened to the call with an AI also listening and alerting. Guess what? There was no improvement. So the AI, although it was still the same AI, was not really helping. So the dispatcher did not pay attention to the AI. So that was the situation. Then somebody in the ethical board still decided to deploy this system. So as of November of 2 years ago, actually of 2020, this system is now implemented. And when you call 112 in Copenhagen, there is an AI that is listening to your call and is alerting the dispatcher, although no clinical trial was actually saying that this is working. So basically we did a self-assessment together with all these medical doctors. We brought a team, Elizabeth was with us, of various people that would not expect that, and try to assess the ethical, technical, legal, and the domain-specific implication by using our assessment, which is basically try to understand why, for example, this AI system doesn't work. And we had exactly discover issues that are under trust, for example, lack of communication, bias, because the system was trained with data that was from native Danish-speaking people. But if you call and you have an accent or you are not Danish, the system is not accurate. And you might actually end up dying. But they didn't think about it. So they basically did not think about it, that a system that doesn't seem to help might actually harm. And so we published the result of a 6-month study. I'm happy to send you something. And that's an example where we give a recommendation to this stakeholder for improving the system. And just to wrap up, I want to mention that we also did a case of so-called co-creation, where we basically worked with a German Center for Research, Artificial Intelligence. They're all engineers, and they basically created a prototype of an AI system that was supposed to help dermatologists to classify skin tumors, with the idea that if you're able to detect a skin tumor, it's actually helping the dermatologist in the early phase of understanding whether he has to do something or not. Now, we came with the team that went from philosopher to medical doctor, different kinds, like public health versus dermatologists and engineers and others. And basically, we turned their initial design into a claim. And we questioned whether this was really useful for the people or for the dermatologist. And what it was very interesting, and obviously I don't have time to go in detail, that we discovered that in order to support a claim, this is going to be useful for a dermatologist because it's very accurate, there was no evidence because the experts, the medical experts, did not agree. A dermatologist sees one patient at a time. So for him, a false positive. So if the system believes that you have a skin cancer, they take away the mole. But for people that are in public health or evidence-based medicine, that was not acceptable. So the important lesson that we learn is that not even domain specialists can actually support clear evidence. And this is really when you start including all of this discussion, the ethical, the technical, legal, at the level of early design. It's surprising because engineers are not trained for even thinking about this, and they can then change the way they do the design in a slightly different way. And to finish, we're working right now on a very big case with a hospital in Italy where they deploy an AI system helping radiologists for detecting. They look at the X-ray of a lung patient that have COVID and giving a score. And now we're into a big assessment, but I don't have the time to go through the detail. But we have all the let's say the results in our website. We have some papers with the process. And then we have the complete results of the 2 assessment. And then we're working right now on finishing up the third one. So I think this is one of the few examples of best practices of what does it mean to help engineers to do co-design and trustworthy AI, or to assess something that has been deployed and somebody has decided, and help the stakeholders to improve. I'd like to stop here because I can speak even for longer, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Roberto, for introducing the SET inspection, C inspection process and project. So my understanding is that we have yeah, and I have to say, I really learned a lot from this process, and this interdisciplinary work is really very useful and very helpful to see from all those different perspectives. People thinking about these systems and thinking about potential implications and having these discussions. I think this is a very fruitful approach, or at least this is what I've experienced so far. And so we have a lot of questions. Kelly, could you perhaps help us read them? So
yeah, there's one, maybe we'll start out with the first one I received. This is for Jason. And it's from a colleague from IIT. He said, "Thank you, Jason. If the system is working well, but for the wrong reasons, maybe trust needs to be calibrated for that as well. For example, classifying mountain lions versus African lions based on background, white versus yellow, might be highly accurate, but it's not clear if it is there for the right reasons. But how can we even determine if a system is doing it correctly with the correct reasoning? How can we even tell if neural networks are doing what they are doing using correct reasoning? Correct is in quotations because I'm not even sure what correct reasoning is and supposed to be in this case."
That's a great question. And of course, a lot of it has to do with human beings, of course, deciding what's correct. I mean, the AI systems can label the world in all sorts of ways, depending on how we want to describe it. So for instance, with lions, you could not only classify it by mountain lions versus African lions, but you could describe it versus, mammals or 4-legged creatures, or creatures with sorry, my office phone keeps ringing. Apologies. You could describe the world in a variety of different ways. So it needs humans. I mean, I don't know if exactly what you're getting at, but it needs humans, and it needs the kinds of values that we have to bring to bear on what is, so to speak, a correct answer in terms of how we want to classify the world. I mean, AI systems might be relatively good at classifying certain items or certain objects, but again, it's up to us to give it the parameters and decide what counts as truth in our view. Roberto, did you want to add something to that, or is that something?
I can certainly. Thank you. I can really add an example, because here is written, if the system working well but for the wrong reason. So who's deciding that? So who is deciding what is the right reason? So we have exactly this situation where we did co-design of this AI system that was supposed to help dermatologists to be more accurate. So the engineers were thinking that it is a good reason to have a system that is very accurate, so it will always detect if there is skin cancer. But sometimes he might actually have a so-called false positive. So he might actually end up thinking that there is a skin cancer when there is no skin cancer. Now, for a dermatologist, this is perfectly good, at least in certain part of the world. When you start talking to other medical doctors, especially in evidence-based medicine, this is totally unacceptable. Obviously, if you have a false positive for a brain tumor, and you actually end up doing an operation that was totally unnecessary, the cost and the harm is huge. But nevertheless, what I wanted to say, that this idea of what is good or wrong normally is left unattended and is part of a design that people don't even realize it. It's only when you come into early co-design, bringing people like Jason, Hele, or Elizabeth, and plus other people like medical doctors, then the discussion starts to say what is good and what is wrong for whom. And the engineer would be totally surprised because they think, okay, I thought that this was good for the dermatology, but what about the patient? And so this is an example. So I can turn everything that's written here into example. And this is fascinating because, I mean, what Jason was saying, over trust and trust is actually a really big thing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Roberto.
So our next question is was posted while Hilla was talking and is posted to her. This is from another colleague from the other IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology. Referring to Professor Elizabeth's recent paper, AI is not conscious like human beings or animals. How can we attribute a moral agency to AI? Shouldn't the developers be held accountable for the harms created by AI?
Yeah, I totally agree, actually. And I think I have argued for that, inserting a functional agency that allows us to actually ascribe certain capabilities, let's say, or capacities to AI systems and devices that we actually want, speech recognition, image recognition, and so on. I think we're really perfecting the game here. And in many respects, we want that, but that doesn't make an actor or an agent a moral agent. So I have argued too, and that really we're entering also deep philosophical terrain and deep ethical, bioethical terrain, because they are also contested approaches, of course. So for ages, last few decades, we have really centered on agency as autonomy due to the fact that bioethics itself is also shaped by cultures. And in this case, it was the American culture of a certain kind of liberalism, of course. So then we try to understand what does agency mean, and we are kind of guided by the notion of autonomy. In Europe, about 20 years ago or so, there was a big effort to bring vulnerability to the forefront and establish that as a principle of biolaw and bioethics by Scandinavians, actually, Rentorf and Peter Kemp, and it was not really successful. So, but if we come from vulnerability, then the notion of agency and moral agency will change too. So my own solution is that actually a human agency and moral agency must be defined as vulnerable agency. And at the same time, this serves me another purpose, namely to understand better what we mean by the concept of dignity that then defines rights and obligations and so on. So I agree with you. But it is not just merely a question of consciousness or anything like that. It is really a question of the human capabilities, including the openness to the other, but that makes us also vulnerable to others.
Yeah, thank you.
The next question we have is from Sarah Blanco. If I understand correctly, the trustee needs to expect the trustor to be trusting, and this is a problem for no human agent since they have no expectations. What about trust as an unquestioning attitude, term taken from Ningun 2021? Don't we trust sometimes as a default attitude? For example, I trust my mother to remember my birthday, and it's not really that she expects my trust, it's just an attitude in the background that's taken for granted.
Yeah, I think first this goes to me again, if I just may, Elizabeth. Yeah, okay. So just one notion. When I say human beings can't but relate to others, whether it is other beings, other things, and so on, and we just remembering our childhood, we know that very well. And also that we call it innocent or naive or trusting or so. Yeah, that is an attitude. But, you know, I wanted to bring into the conversation the reflections on modern technologies from the early 20th century and then throughout the 20th century, because there is a certain mistrust. What do these modern technologies do? And do we lose something that made us human before. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation, because the overtrust, undertrust is almost a technical term, but underneath that is really a cultural approach, a personal approach, and so on, that we need to take into consideration, and that complicates matters, of course, you know. So I know that from the robots in nursing homes, for example, especially with elderly, you know, deception, betrayal, and exploitation of emotional needs, that is always on the table. And as an outsider observer, ethicist, I must say, not to reflect upon that, that would be a big mistake. Yeah? And then we come back to the conversation of self-assessment and observation. Being critical, that is a task of ethics. Being critical does not take away trust. It is meant to build up trust, but behind the machines there, it needs to be a kind of a, I think we all say the same in that respect, there needs to be a reflection on the programmers, on the designers, and so on.
And were you saying in your question, or were you alluding in your question that trust is something like a default mechanism? Maybe it's not even trust, maybe it's just our reaction. I mean, there's a social cognition research, and this is just how our brain reacts to robots, because this is how we react to human beings, and we just react similarly, and there may not even be trust involved. It may, I mean, if I say an automatism, that's too strong, because of course we build those robots that have anthropomorphic features and that make us react to the robots in a similar way as we react to humans. But this may be another thing, that it may sometimes not just be not be trust, but it may just be a kind of
Yeah, but the question, Sarah, was that her name? She said something about expectations, and that I find really interesting. You know, it is maybe an openness, maybe you can call it trust or so. And I said the position matters. You know, I trust the other, but the device counts on that. That's what Alexa does. That's what Facebook does. Actually, they exploit a certain openness or trust that we have. And I said, and I stick to that actually, that we use the word trust and trustworthiness in a metaphorical way. And we always need to understand that this language is analogical. It is metaphorical.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay.
So are we ready to move on to the next question? Okay. So this is from Daniel Schiff. To any panelist, US and EU policymakers have a pretty strong focus on trustworthy AI, but their emphases may or may not be fully aligned with the dimensions of trust you have suggested. How would you evaluate how policymakers are approaching AI and trust? Is this approach thoughtful and sufficient, or is anything missing?
So if you don't mind, I'd like to start answering that, because I follow quite closely both of them. So first of all, we have to understand that the policymakers have a completely different mindset than the discussion that we are having here. Especially, they're not interested in the theoretical setting. They're more interested in the risk attitude. So basically, if you look at what the EU policymaking are doing, and the Americans are actually doing the same, they're really looking at some guidelines that was also given by ethical committee on classifying ethical AI system by potential risk. So you need to think in this way. So think you're buying a fridge. Somebody has discovered this amazing labeling of energy consumption. So you buy a fridge that has the labeling, and you simply say how much energy is consuming. So if you have a law that says you have to have a fridge that is consuming a certain level, you cannot sell a fridge that has an energy consumption. Or you have, for example, somebody that discovered that if you have a car, you have to bring it to inspection every 1 or 2 years because there's safety issues. Now, that's basically what they're trying to do. The EU has basically come up with a pyramid where on top there are AI systems that are not acceptable for certain standards in Western world, like, face. And then you have a set of other AI systems that are potentially highly risk, and the rest is basically for them is like, the vendor should be doing a self-assessment and is responsible if something goes wrong. So the focus there is less on the theoretical discussion, is more on liability, accountability, and basically regulation. Now, you might actually be happy or not with that, because especially what is very important to understand that when you even this AI system might change over time. And who's going to monitor this system? So who's going to monitor this system over time? So, and this is really an issue because the policymakers are very much detached from all the discussion that you heard here, and they go from all the legal part, the regulation part. You might like it or not, but that's basically what is happening. And then, as Helle said, there are huge cultural differences in countries. So this is the European or the American view. Nobody's talking about China or other places.
May I just jump in here, Jason? I don't know whether you want to say something, but I want to say something about the practice, about these ethics commissions and so on, the advisors to the policymakers, because yeah, it may be sure, but it may be true that the policymakers, the parliamentarians, and so on, and in whatever regime we're talking, that they are not interested, and they must not be interested, and may not be interested in all these things. But the policies are not made ultimately in the parliament. The policies are prepared for in the committees and so on. And I've been on the European Ethics Committee for Science and New Technologies for 10 years. And for every report we did, we would spend 2 days every month in Brussels and have hearings sometimes for a year before we would write our report. And so, yeah, theoretical discussions, the discussions that we have, they go into that. And I must say, as much as I really want to emphasize the cultural differences and the differences between, let's say, scientists and lawyers and philosophers and theologians and philosophers and all of them, to politicians ultimately, that all is a process. And I think in Europe, actually right now, more than in the US, as far as I can see, there has been really a focus on these social and ethical and ultimately then legal and political questions. And we're really trying our very best to make it as secure, safe, trustworthy, whatever words we use, ethical at the end of the day, as possible. But there is also a practice of the policy making. And I remember that, all these ethical questions would go into the EGE, the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. That is done with because they became too critical, I think, for the European Commission. So there's also kind of political, let's say, everyday life and political goals and maybe even ideologies at work. And we must also look at these. And the last thing I want to say, there are always also economic interests in play. And ethics also has to look at that. Whether a certain device or system is being invented and then kind of be channeled into the market, there may be very different plural motivations. And it is our task to really look whether they make sense, whether they are ethical, but also whether there are alternatives. And that is what I would think is a basic requirement of a kind of a background assessment and evaluation of these systems. And all of that together will then hopefully at least help us trust them a little bit more than we might do right now.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. Do you want to add something, Jason?
Not really much to add, except picking up one of the last points Hilary was making, that a lot of these reports are trying to balance out, of course, economic and innovation related considerations. Of course, a lot of these high level national or federal reports want to make a statement that they're a leader in AI. And depending on which region of the world and who's participating in the development of the document, they may mention a whole collection of different kinds of ethical issues. And a lot of times they're circling around safety related kinds of issues. And again, but it depends on a lot of times what region of the globe is producing the report and who participated in its development.
Any further questions? I think we've answered all the ones that were in the Q&A.
Yeah, it looks like. Are there any additional questions?
I just wanted to say or to comment on something that Roberto said about the dialects and the languages very shortly, just to emphasize how difficult it sometimes is to even with something that has been kind of modified and perfected so much as speech recognition and so on. And I find it really very, very important to not only focus on the implicit biases that go into these systems, but also the very simple things that language is not just semantics as we learned in linguistics, but also about pragmatics. That means contextual knowledge comes into play here. And I thought it was fascinating what you reported. That was just a comment. Jason, I think I cut you off here.
I was going to ask Roberto a question, but I don't know if we have time or not. Do we have time for it? If he doesn't mind.
I think we do, yeah.
I was kind of curious, and hopefully this is not too complex, but I was kind of curious how the problems get framed that your group looks at. So for example, looking at the issues of the accuracy of AI algorithms to read a medical scan. So that could be framed very narrowly in terms of, is it more accurate than a human being? But it also could be framed more broadly about how does it impact the relationship between the patient and the caregiver, and whether it might replace radiologists. In other words, depending on how narrowly or broadly you frame the problem, it could grow very large or could be very specific. So I'm wondering, is there a particular way that you try to narrow or broaden the scope in terms of identifying what kind of problem to tackle?
Well, thank you, Jason. That's actually, you're referring to the last use case with the COVID, and that is a case which I think also Elizabeth is really working as a part of our team, which is extremely interesting because it's done under pandemic circumstances. So the deployment of this AI was not done like in the case of the 112 emergency call in Copenhagen under normal circumstances. It was done under emergency, meaning that they deploy. So basically, now you're playing with people's life, expecting that somehow this should help, because the situation is so bad. So I mean, for our expert in ethics and in the medical part, this is a really interesting question. What does it mean, trustworthy AI under pandemic? I think Elizabeth actually has written exactly one part of this. Maybe Elizabeth can say more, because she has really, with the 3 other more experts, has really looked at exactly this question. We are still working on that, but I found it a fascinating question, which is really, what does it mean saving people, but you're trying, you're experimenting? So I don't know, yeah, Elizabeth, you want to comment on that? Because that's really what you've been looking at in the last month.
I brought this up because it was really in our meeting, we were like saying, oh, we don't know that, and we don't know that, and it's not transparent, and here's the problem, and here. And the group in Italy, they were really stressing, okay, our radiologists, they had such a lot of issues here. We didn't know what to do anymore. This was something like, I mean, our last chance is too strong, but this was really difficult. And we just managed to to help the radiologist and everything. And there was a lack of resources. And in this specific situation, yeah, what do you do? Also about standards, about clinical standards, you don't know anything about the system. And yeah, I find this is a fascinating topic, and slowly papers come up in this about this. Isn't it about the use of AI in the COVID situation? I mean, yeah.
I think there should be also a rule of thumb here that you know, complementing human actions is actually, in that respect, AI is very, very helpful. But when it becomes a substitute or replaces human actions, then it may be cost effective, although even that can be doubted, but it is kind of coined as innovation and what have you. But there are so many complex issues at play that it becomes problematic. And at least I think that is where, Jason, where you also come in with your work. It needs to be really thoroughly assessed and evaluated before one moves forward with a particular device, with a particular system, and so on. But nevertheless, I think often this rule of thumb is lost on the way, because there are also consumerism and commercial interests and what have you, all these things that actually define then or inform the ultimate decision of whether to bring a certain system to the market or so. And I think that is a difficulty that we have as kind of ethical evaluators or so, how to keep that in play even post-market and so on, so that people, for example, can comply with all the criteria that clinical medical ethics has set up, kind of that you have to be able to withdraw your consensus or consent at any point, yeah, so that you can switch from a robot medical advice, let's say, to a human person. And that is not the case, of course, yeah. And I think there are a lot of questions that need to be resolved in practice and in the procedures, but it is not so much that we don't have the criteria.
Yeah, and the problem when something is supposed to be a complementing humans, and when it ends up substituting humans, I mean, that's another. But yeah, this is a huge topic. We have another question. Should we go ahead with this?
Sure, we're running a little short on time, but we certainly can.
That's the problem. We are short on time. The system will end at 2 o'clock. Is this? Will it automatically?
I think it might, but we can hang in there and see what happens.
Maybe we just read the question and I try to find the 159 and then I say goodbye.
All right, so what a heroic undertaking to create a framework on which to deal with basically one aspect of humanity. As has been noted, this must apply across all cultures with different mores. Machines that imitate animals are thousands of years old. With the advent of our modern machines with its definitions of intelligence and information, we have attempted to reach the ultimate, a singularity. A famous poetic thought, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's heaven's for.
Is this a question?
I think it's more of a statement, perhaps. Maybe it's a good note to end on.
May I just share my screen for a moment to actually point the people who are in the webinar to another conversation, this time with Professor Julian Kinderlehrer, who was the last president of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, and he will join us on October 7th. At Loyola University, but you can also, he will be there via Zoom, and you can also watch and listen if you register. If you go to Loyola's website or just email me, or Elizabeth maybe, then she can forward your requests to me, okay? I just wanted to let you know. So he will speak of the two last reports by the European Group on Ethics and gene editing and artificial intelligence, okay?
Yeah, Thank you, Hille. And some of the attendants may be interested in this. We are now at the end of today's webinar. We have only a few minutes left, if at all. I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I'd like to thank Kelly for doing the technical part of the webinar. I'd like to thank all the attendees, especially for your questions, for your interesting questions and comments. Thanks for being here. We plan to do another webinar on artificial intelligence, probably on AI in agriculture and ethical and social implications on November 15th. So we'll see how this goes. Thanks for being with us, and have a good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, take care. Bye. Thank you.